well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Vikrant Reddy. I'm a policy analyst here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation in our Center for Effective Justice. We're talking today about overcriminalization. A few years ago, a book came out that some of you may have heard of by an acquaintance of mine named Harvey Silverglate. The book was called 3 Felonies a Day, and the thesis of the book is essentially what that title suggests. That is that all of you, on average, probably commit about 3 felonies a day. At this point, most of you are about 1 or 2 right now. We're only halfway through. Now, you're probably saying, well, I got up this morning, I had breakfast, I had lunch, I don't recall robbing anybody. But those aren't the kinds of things we're talking about. We've gotten to a point in our country now where criminal codes just keep expanding and expanding. And all kinds of trivial little things, business practices, day-to-day habits that we never would have considered criminal are now punishable by potential incarceration. Here in Texas alone, we've got 1,700 crimes. And I wish I could tell you could just turn to the penal code and read all of them, but they're not all in the penal code. They're scattered throughout our statutes. And it's impossible to sort of corral all of them. We just continue to pass new criminal laws every single session. I was told by my colleague, Jeanette Mall, that there's a possible bill pending in the upcoming session that would criminalize cheating in a game of poker. And you're all probably saying, well, Vikrant, that's silly, that's never going to pass. Well, in our session just 2 years ago, we passed a criminal sanction against cheating in a fishing tournament. So these kinds of things do pass, and it wouldn't shock me if this one passed either. So we're going to talk today about what we can do to address this problem. Before we dig deep into the issue, I want to play a short video to kind of introduce all of us to the topic.
Overcriminalization is the over-reliance upon the criminal laws to affect the way people behave. The problems that come from that there are many different kinds. It's not only what we make criminal, how we make it criminal, how the laws work, how they're enforced, who enforces them, who has the decision to enforce them.
What do we mean when we talk about overcriminalization? It's a word that means many different things to many different people, but at its core, it means that too many things are being defined today as crimes, i.e. things that can land you in jail as opposed to paying some sort of monetary penalty or what have you. And too many things are being prosecuted by the government, particularly by the federal government, which traditionally has left crime prevention largely in the hands of the states, but increasingly has been the prosecutor of choice when it comes to criminal law enforcement.
So the concept of overcriminalization has 4 points. One is Congress passes too many criminal laws. The second is that it passes too many overlapping criminal laws. Lots of different laws govern the same conduct. The third is when it does pass criminal laws, Congress doesn't clearly define what it takes to violate the law. And the fourth part of overcriminalization is that when it creates crimes, Congress imposes far too heavy penalties for the crimes that it does create.
Ordinary conduct, which no one would think is really criminal in nature, has a criminal penalty attached and therefore fits into this category that we would call overcriminalization.
Overcriminalization refers to the expansion, in recent years, a fairly dramatic expansion of conduct that has criminal consequences. It also refers to the tendency to take conduct that previously was criminal only under state or local law and to make it a federal crime. It can also refer to the weakening of mens rea standards, which are intent, state of mind standards.
As one prominent law professor put it, we've turned tort law into criminal law. And I think that part of the driver is that many people in the country, when someone is hurt, instead of just wanting compensation on the tort side, they want that person to go to jail. But we make a distinction between moral culpability and accidents. So for instance, I could be driving in a car and tragically kill another person. But there's a huge difference between whether I accidentally kill them and run them down deliberately. We all understand the distinction. One only involves civil liability. There's no moral culpability there. The other involves not only civil liability, it involves true moral culpability. You had the intent to kill. That's the distinction between civil and criminal. Unfortunately, I think that this distinction is being lost.
When you have some sort of an environmental catastrophe, a factory explosion, a mine collapse, whatever it is, we go right to criminality as the answer. And that's wrong. We've got to stop it. We've got to roll back this overcriminalization. And increasingly, this is what gives me hope for the future. Increasingly, people of all political philosophies are coming to recognize it. And that is why I believe we're on the cusp of a shift.
I don't know how your average law-abiding citizen actually determines what's criminal and what's not. At this point, we have 4,450 federal criminal laws on the books. And I'm pretty sure that I don't know all of them, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I don't know how your average citizen would know all of them. But it's not even just the 4,450 that's in the US Code. We have, scholars have estimated, another 100,000, 200,000, maybe 300,000 federal laws that are hidden in our federal regulations. And I say hidden, not because I'm trying to be provocative, but because our own government hasn't been able to count them all. They've been asked. The Department of Justice has been asked to tell us how many criminal laws exist and where are all of them. And they can't answer that question. So if they don't know, how do we know?
When we've seen this growth in regulatory offenses where there's no harm to any individual victim, but rather it's that you essentially harm the government by doing an act that didn't harm any individual, and that oftentimes it's only fines that you're paying. There's no one to make restitution to because there is no individual victim. Then we're moving literally back to a day and age where when you had monarchies, and if you committed a crime against someone, there was no restitution to the victim. The money or fine or restitution went to the king because you harmed one of the king's subjects. And so this is totally at odds with the founding of our nation and our traditions, and we absolutely have to get back to the idea that crimes focus on harm to others, and that restitution to the victim needs to be foremost, and that this idea that the victim is the government is a really dangerous trend to follow.
Overcriminalization also applies to the problem of statutes that are written vaguely and worded so broadly that most American citizens wouldn't be able to figure out what's against the law and what isn't from not reading the law. And obviously the problem with that is if we don't understand what the law is, then we can't make sure that we're not violating it.
We have 2.3 million people in jail in this country. That's an unheard of statistic. We imprison more people than any other country on earth. Are we really a nation of bad people? Are we a nation of criminals? I don't think so. I think what we are is we are a nation that has become addicted to the idea that criminal sanctions are the way that we should run our society. And so we see this, whether it's in crimes related to substance abuse or crimes related to environmental abuse. Our first choice is a criminal statute and imprisonment, and we've got to change that. We can't have a network of laws that make it impossible for people to function.
A lot of that video is focused on federal overcriminalization, and I think you can make a strong case that our national economy has been sapped because of overcriminalization at that level. And I think if we're not careful here in Texas, we're going to see the same thing happen to what is right now a wonderful economic engine in our state. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, and we're going to start with Norman Riemer, who you guys saw in the video. He's from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which really is the preeminent criminal defense bar association in the entire country. He's the executive director of the organization and the publisher of Champion Magazine, which NACDL publishes. Norman also speaks as a practitioner because before you got into the policy side of things, you were a practicing defense lawyer for 28 years. So folks, please welcome Norman Riemer.
Thanks, Vikrant, and thank you, first of all, to all of you for inviting me to participate. I'm very honored to be in Texas and to speak before representatives and staff from the legislature. I'm also honored to follow myself on a video. That's really a special treat. But I'm going to take advantage of the video to truncate my remarks somewhat because I think you've gotten a pretty good introduction to it. Overcriminalization is truly a growing problem in this country. And there's a very good chance that it has touched the lives of everybody in this room in one way or another. And there's also a pretty good chance that some of you may be contributing to it in the work that goes on in the legislature. It doesn't matter what party you belong to. It doesn't matter what your political philosophy is. You could be a conservative, a liberal, a moderate, or whatever. And it's certainly not a red state or a blue state problem. It is a 50-state problem. Overcriminalization is the massive overuse of criminal laws, the power to prosecute, to condemn, to imprison, as a tool to regulate personal, social, and economic behavior. And I like to remind people to keep in mind that short of warfare, the power to prosecute is the most awesome use of government power, and it should be used sparingly. But unfortunately, in this country over the last 30 years, it has not been used sparingly. For too long, lawmakers from all persuasions have been all too ready to jump, as Vikrant said, almost every session in almost every legislature in the country produces new criminal laws. There's never a time where we say, hey, let's get rid of some of the criminal laws that don't apply. I was actually out with somebody last night who was telling me about this law that makes it a crime to shoot a deer that's on somebody else's property, a criminal sanction that actually carries a severe penalty. Maybe there's a time to adjust some of that. And don't get me wrong, no one questions that acts of violence and theft and traditional wrongdoing, including even violations of basic civic duties, deserve to be prosecuted. But we've come a long way from that. As you saw in the video, we lead the world in incarceration, and I don't believe that it's because we're a nation of criminals. It's because we've made some policy choices that I think are wrong, and I hope that we can change it. Now, I want to talk about solutions and what you can do practically, and I'm also going to talk about a very painful example of how this comes about. But I want to put this into some very concrete context for all of you. You saw some different figures on that video, and there are actually others there's a whole series of these videos that we've got that a number of groups have posted on their websites. But I would ask this question, what do such disparate groups as the Heritage Foundation, the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Legislative Exchange Council, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, the Chamber of Commerce, Texas Public Policy Foundation, all have in common? The answer is they all agree with my organization, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, that overcriminalization is a problem. And in a very real sense, what this is evidence that what I call the arc of justice has bent in such a way that both ends of the political spectrum have come to realize that there's an emerging consensus that the criminal justice system is out of control. Now, here's what these groups fundamentally agree on. 5 ingredients of overcriminalization. 1, we have too many criminal laws. Laws that criminalize behavior that is not inherently wrong. 2, the criminal laws that we have are often overlapping and duplicative. We've created a network of criminal statutes that geometrically expand exposure to prosecution, and for no good reason. 3, many of these crimes are vague. The prohibited act is often not clearly defined. People don't know that it's criminal. 4, and this may be one of the most important, many crimes do not include a clear intent requirement. Now, lawyers learn early in their law school career that traditionally a crime is comprised of 2 parts, a prohibited act and a criminal state of mind. The Latin for this is actus reus and mens rea.
Mens rea is the essence of a crime. It's the guilty mind. That is what gives the state the moral authority to prosecute someone. A person is entitled to notice that something is a crime and that they should be acting with an intention to violate the law. But we have abandoned that tradition. We are using criminal law even when a person doesn't intend to break the law. We've expanded it to include reckless behavior and negligent behavior. We've introduced such ideas as deliberate indifference or willful disregard, and so that even in the absence of an intent, a judge will tell a jury, you can find a person guilty. And worst of all, we have increasingly started to prosecute people on a theory of strict liability. That is, even if the person had no criminal intent, if they did a particular act, they can be held criminally responsible and sent to prison. Fifth, we use the criminal laws as a catch-all reaction to every social problem, and we do it without regard to its true cost. And I want to give you some concrete examples. 3 years ago, we did a study of misdemeanor courts in the country called Minor Crimes, Massive Waste. Do you know what we found, by the way, that the criminal courts were saturated with petty offenses, and the jails, as you just heard, are filled with mostly nonviolent offenders. And of course, we all know in particular about the tremendous role that possessory offenses play in all of that. But let me tell you what the single most prosecuted crime in this country is. It's driving with a suspended license. And it's not because people are all driving recklessly. It's because licenses are suspended for all kinds of reasons related to civil infractions. Not paying child support, not paying for your car registration, not paying for your parking fines. Let me give you some other examples. In New York City, where I come from, it is a crime to take up 2 seats on a subway. As you all know, in many places, it's a crime to drink in public. Not a civil infraction, a crime. In some communities in Florida, it is a crime to feed the homeless. That's how people decided they would deal with the problem of having homeless people. Let's make it a crime to feed them. Then they'll go to somebody else's community. The trend doesn't stop. Just within the last year, Kentucky made it a criminal offense to release a pig into the woods. And in a town in Kansas, I think it's called Wellington, it is now a criminal offense to have more than 4 house cats. And this, by the way, is only an extension of an existing law that already made it a crime to have more than 4 dogs. Now, why does this happen? It happens because our natural tendency is to respond to every bad thing that happens with a criminal law. There's a knee-jerk reaction that someone must be punished whenever something bad happens. But the simple truth is that not all bad things are criminal. Accidents happen. Human beings are fallible. Not every mistake is a crime. Not every failure to comply with a regulation should be treated as a criminal act. You see, criminalizing behavior creates the illusion of solving a problem. It has the allure of seeming to cost nothing. There's never any fiscal allocation that goes along with a new criminal statute. But it is just that, an illusion. It's a mirage. The costs are real, and they're not just direct. It costs real dollars to investigate, to prosecute, to process, to defend, to supervise, to incarcerate. But who thinks about that when they enact a new crime? It takes a potentially productive member of society, one who generates revenue through myriad activities, and turns him or her into a cost. And then, of course, there are the indirect costs, the broken families, the destroyed lives, and the lost opportunities. I want to discuss how this happens, and I want to do it in the context of a very recent and very public tragedy. I want you to consider the case involving Offadell Williams. Mr. Williams was a bus driver in New York City, driving a group of people back to New York from a casino outing in Connecticut. He apparently dozed off momentarily at the wheel, lost control of the bus, and the tragic accident killed 15 passengers. This is a colossal tragedy. 15 lives lost, countless families and friends and co-workers deprived of the companionship of a human life. But the question is, does it call for new criminal laws? Mr. Williams was not driving recklessly. He was not speeding. He was not taking drugs. He had not been drinking. He was not talking on his cell phone. He was not texting. Yet he was charged with 15 counts of homicide. What's more, despite the lack of a criminal history, he was held in jail on unattainable bail for 1.5 years. The jury heard this case and returned a verdict of not guilty. And now there is a national movement to make driving while drowsy a criminal offense. Now, why is that happening? Because they tried to prove that he was reckless. They tried to prove that he was negligent. The jury rejected it. So now we should have a statute that simply makes the fact that you were drowsy a crime. New Jersey has already passed a criminal law that treats a person who is driving without having slept for 24 hours the exact same as a drunk driver. Several other states have legislation introduced that would make driving while drowsy a criminal offense, including some that would make it a felony. Oregon has a bill that was introduced that could include penalties up to 20 years in prison. Texas, by the way, to my knowledge, has legislation pending to study the problem. And if studying the problem leads to greater awareness and greater public education, that's a great thing. But I would urge everyone to stop for a moment and think about the consequences before making this a crime. Every traffic accident will result in a criminal investigation. Not just horrible tragedies like that bus accident, but every single fender bender will be a potential prosecution. Just like there now is an investigation to determine if the person had been taking drugs or drinking, there will be an investigation to see when the person last went to sleep. And what would the criminal intent in such a statute look like? What would protect innocent people? What effect would this have on working people? We have folks who work 2 jobs and support families. They're among the best among us. Are we going to make them all potential criminals? And what about police officers and firefighters who are sometimes required to work multiple shifts to help keep us safe? This is, in my opinion, the classic example of how overcriminalization happens. You have a terrible tragedy, you have a desire to see someone pay for it, and we're off to the races. And by the way, why stop at driving while drowsy? Why not cooking while drowsy? You know how many fires start because somebody left something on the stove and fell asleep? Or I have another one, and this is 3 felonies a day. Ironing while drowsy. Last night, I kid you not, I came in through Houston, it had been pouring. I found that my clothing was wet, and before I went to sleep, I was going to iron it. I set the iron up and lay down while it was warming up and fell asleep. Now, it just so happens the iron's now cut off automatically, but you see what I'm getting at. So whether it's dealing with terrible tragedies that are the results of accidents and human frailty, or the misguided efforts to regulate social behavior or commercial activity, this is what causes it. Now, I only have a couple of minutes, but let me get to the point and let me tell you what I think you can do to fix it. Because I do believe that folks who are involved in the legislatures are the ones who can fix this. Few basic principles. 1, identify all the criminal provisions in a law. Look carefully to see if buried in some statute that's dealing with some civil problem, there's a criminal penalty buried in it. If it does have a criminal provision, ask if it's truly needed. Are there other laws that cover the same conduct? Are there other ways to address the conduct through civil fines or remedies? Is the problem really a common problem, or is it just an aberration? Is the law one that people can readily comply with and can understand? 3, is the conduct that is prohibited clearly described? Is it clear enough so that every average citizen would realize what it is? 4, is the level of intent, that phrase again, mens rea, is it clearly defined? As to each element that constitutes the prohibited act, does the law clearly say that it has what the necessary intent is? And I also suggest that we need to have default mens rea provisions. I understand Texas has a reckless standard. I think it should be higher, but having some is better than none. 5, there should be a rule of lenity. That is a rule that provides that if a law is unclear, the accused person should get the benefit of the doubt and not be prosecuted. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a legislature should have a requirement that every single proposed new criminal penalty should be accompanied by an impact statement, some assessment of the actual costs of enforcing that law, actual costs to law enforcement, to courts, to the process, to the judging, to the defending, all of that. And anticipated, and also an assessment of the costs on the impact on commercial activity and personal freedom. So let me close with this observation. As the director of the nation's criminal defense bar, sometimes when I go around and make the case against overcriminalization, I kind of feel like I'm the head of a bakers association opposing the use of sugar and flour. fewer criminal laws is not exactly something that is in the best interest of the criminal defense bar, at least not our business interests. But we defense lawyers see firsthand, and we see it every day, the hardship that the country's over-reliance on criminal prosecutions has brought to millions of individuals, families, and businesses, both large and small. And we see the enormous waste of money that we pour into what is one of the most least productive of government functions. It's okay to be tough on crime if it's real crime, but we should be smart, we should be prudent, we should be humane, and we should be cost-conscious. And we need to end this obsession with criminalization. And I think to end it, it's going to begin with folks like you, legislators and staff people who are making the laws. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is going to be William Caligari. He represents District 132 here in Texas and has represented that district since the year 2000. He's the chairman of the House Research Organization, and he's the chairman of the House Greater Houston Area Delegation. But his most important role in the previous session was as the chairman of the House Committee on Government Efficiency and Reform. That is the committee that confronts a whole lot of occupational licensing issues. And at the state level, that is really sort of the forefront of the overcriminalization fight. So, Chairman Caligari?
Thank you very much. Let me do correct something. My committee, Government Efficiency and Reform, really didn't have responsibility for occupational licenses. We actually have another committee that does that. What my committee did is try to get rid of those that were created on the other side. And an interesting aspect of that is about a year ago, we had Governor Bush from Florida come in to make a presentation about, government issues and government reform, if you will, to the legislators. And in the process of his discussion, he made the comment that as governor, he would make an attempt to get some legislator to pass a bill that would eliminate 5 or 6 occupations. And he said the problem is before we got through the session, somebody would create 10 more. Well, when he did that, my chief of staff, who was in the audience but in another place, emailed me and said he stole your speech, because I had been saying that for years. And that is a problem. We tend to create these licenses because somebody sees something that they think needs to be protected, or an entity or agency that needs to be protected, and that's what happens. We create a licensing requirement that in many times not only creates a burden on society, but it creates some criminal activity as well. But let me back up and make sure here where ought to be. Uh-oh. There we are. Okay, thank you. All right. 2 interims ago, my committee, the House Committee on Governmental Reform and Efficiency and Reform, looked into the issue of occupational licensing. What we found was pretty alarming. We found that here are some of the jobs that are regulated in Texas, and when you look at this, you say, well, these seem to be okay, probably. Some of these things need some area of legislation, of regulation. However, this is just a short list. This is the real list of licenses that we occupy, that we regulate. State of Texas regulates over 500 different kinds of occupations in businesses that accounts for nearly 3 million individuals within the state's workforce. Texas prides itself in being a low regulation state, but we actually, in reality, regulate more occupations than the average state does. The national average for workforce regulation is 28%. Texas regulates over 1/3 of its workers, or requires some form of state-issued license, permit, or certification in order to do business. That's pretty extreme when you think about it. And in addition, as I said, the list of occupations that we license grows every year. As I said, over the last, I came in the year 2000, and probably in about 2003, I started trying to eliminate some licenses. And some years I've been able to take out 2 or 3 or 4, but every time we did that, we'd end up with 10 or 15 added on at that same time. So it's somewhat of a losing battle. It is interesting to stop and think what a license really does. When we begin to regulate a profession or business through licensing laws, we're doing two things. Once we establish an exclusive right to practice a certain profession for those who are licensed. We also, in many, many cases, create a new crime, that of engaging in a regulated practice without the requisite license. If you sit down and read the chapters of law creating these licensing programs, many explicitly state that it's illegal to practice or engage in that practice without a license. Some have criminal, some have civil penalties, and some have both. Over the past 60 years, the legislation has created hundreds of new crimes by creating new licensing agreements. Here's some examples of those kinds of crimes. First regulated in 1983, the unlicensed practice of speech-language pathology could land somebody in the county jail for up to 6 months and a fine up to $1,000. Those of you who may have seen the Oscar-winning movie The King's Speech, which was about a speech therapist who assisted King George VI, that therapist was not licensed by the crime. If that was done here in Texas, he could have gone to jail. Interesting. Without a license and using the title of art therapist without a license could result in a Class B misdemeanor. If I were to call myself an art therapist and ask somebody to draw a picture of how they feel, I could be thrown in jail for 180 degrees. I mean, there are just a lot of absurd examples of what happens. This, to me, is one of the best. Shampoo apprentice. If you're shampooing your child, a loved one at home, or a neighbor, or a friend, you could be in violation. Shampoos are required to be licensed, yet according to Forbes magazine, there are 14,000 shampooers nationwide with an average pay of $14,200. You know, it's hard to imagine why we should have a license for shampoo and hair in the first place, but so few people are involved in it makes it even more absurd. There are many other licensed occupations which individuals may be criminally prosecuted for practices without a license. Here are some of the others. When you look at the column on the left, those list occupations which may be, where you may be charged a misdemeanor for practicing a license, which would include 1 year in jail and a penalty up to $4,000. The one on the right, lists what I would call real criminal acts that are eligible for that same penalty. In the eyes of Texas justice, it really doesn't matter. Either one carries the same penalty, so you could be guilty without realizing it. In fact, I would dare say that many of us have neighbors, friends, maybe relatives, children, or whatever that have violated and could go to jail for something that they're violating, as was mentioned earlier, that they don't even know about. Time is the same as getting. Excuse me. This part of my thing. Getting caught doing. Getting caught doing a massage. Doing massage therapy without a license for the second time is the same as getting for a second DWI. Not quite the same kind of penalty violation, I might say. Processing shellfish without a license merits the same penalty as violating a family violence code order. Inspected real estate without a license ranks up there with car burglary and perjury. In my mind, it's not quite the same thing, and I think you would probably agree. While I have no quarrel with penalties associated with criminal offenses, in fact, I think some of them may be a little light in some cases, I don't understand how the public interest is served by sending somebody to jail for, as an unlicensed psychologist or real estate inspector or a tattooist or whatever for a year. And we just have gone very, much too far. And I have to give credit right now to my good friend Jerry Madden, who's in the audience, chaired our criminal justice committee for a few years, in alerting me to this issue and how important it was, and the fact that maybe one of the ways to reduce the whole issue, or to evaluate and try to cut down on the number of licenses, is to look at the criminal aspect, and that was certainly fueled by Mr. Levin and by a lot of people in TPPF to encourage us to continue in that direction, and we're continuing to look at that. The problem is, how do you do that in one fell swoop? So I ask you guys to help us figure out how to get there from here, because it is not an easy thing to do. Let me back up for the road to reform. Texas needs to take several steps, I think, in what we call the licensing mess. As I said, I've been working on this for about 10 years or so. If we don't, we will continue to end up with more regulations, fees, taxes, bureaucrats, and agencies to reform them. And keep in mind that every one of these occupational agents, you say, well, what harm does it do? It probably protects the public. Well, in some cases, they may protect the public, but in every case, and a lot of people say, by the way, is it really doesn't cost anything because the people who are licensed are the one that pays the fees. Well, let's remember that those people who pay the fees, who are licensed, are not going to just pay that fee and forget about it. That fee gets passed on in whatever service they provide to you. And it's important that we make sure that we don't overburden our citizens with fees that they shouldn't have. And it's one of the reasons that I think we should make a much stronger effort to try to cut back on these licenses. It's just a very hard thing to do. I've tried to take them out one by one from year to year, and as I said, you take out 2 and we get 4 added, so that's not the route to go. So I'm still looking for the best way. Over criminalization, attacking that I think is going to be one way, but I still look for different ways. So again, I ask those of you here on the podium and those of you in the audience, tell us what ideas you might have. We do need to critically evaluate or reevaluate the way that we assess the need for licensing. So I have basically 2 bills that I have filed to try to approach that. One is House Bill 86, which would amend the Sunset Act to enhance the Sunset Advisory Commission's review of existing occupational licensing programs to ensure that they do achieve a meaningful public interest. That is protection of life and safety and health. If it also places a statute for the first time that occupational licenses should be judged against public interest and defines public interest as meaning protection from a demonstrable, present, and recognizable harm to the public. When you look at occupational licenses, many of them don't do that. They only serve, as I mentioned earlier, to protect the particular industry that they're involved in. Only those threats that really affect the life and health of our people, should be allowed to continue. And in an earlier presentation I made, Mr. Heflin, who's with TPPF, made the comment that as an engineer, I would probably oppose doing away with licenses for engineers. I'm not sure that I would disagree with that. I'm not sure that a lot of occupations really need to be licensed. Sometimes we have to rely on the good judgment and the credibility and the honesty of the people in those businesses to make sure they do the right thing. We've got enough laws on the books to protect us. We don't need a lot of new laws we've got fraud protection, we've got licenses laws in effect, statutes that protect the people from severe violations of people's rights and what have you. We don't really need a lot more occupational licenses to accomplish that, but we do need a way we need to find an efficient way to reduce those, and I have to admit I haven't found that way. So I ask you, those of you in the audience, those of you who struggled with this for a while, help us find a way to write this law that may help to get there. We have so many laws that relate to fraud, theft, deceptive trade practices, and what have you. We don't need new stuff. We've got to find a way to cut the legs out from under those licenses that we have. Those licenses really ought to be done in most cases by the trade organizations that control those industries, not by the government. But again, we've got to find a way to do that. Just a few takeaways, if I might, because I'm out of town. One is Texas, to remind you that Texas regulates an extraordinarily large segment of its workforce. 2, increased regulation has led to a proliferation of new crimes, which we need to cut back on, and we will work on that. Looking at converting penalties that are criminal violations now to civil penalties. Again, easier said, not easy to do, but we're going to look at that. And third is a long-term solution is less government regulation for occupations, and not just occupations, everything we do, and better reliance on a free market, which we really need to concentrate on, and we need efforts of people in the audience who who are in business and deal with these things on a day-to-day basis to tell us where your basic problems are. Help us, help us solve your problem, but you got to tell us what your problem is. So with that, I thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Our next speaker is going to be Shannon Edmonds. He's the Director of Governmental Relations for the Texas District and County Attorneys Association. In that capacity, Shannon is the liaison between the state's prosecutors and the state legislature. In a few months, Shannon's probably once again going to be writing the Legislative Update book, which is a terrific resource for those of you who are interested in this topic. You should pick it up. I assume you're all interested in it because, did you pick it? There you go.
Someone's going to walk home with us today.
It really is a terrific analysis and insight. You'll get a little bit of that analysis and insight right now as we welcome Shannon Edmonds.
Don't count this against me, Danny. This doesn't count on my time. Well, I'd like to thank the TPPF for having me back again. I have given this talk, which I have updated though, to keep it current for this session. I'm disappointed in a way not to see more elected officials here, but that's probably good for me because I'm going to speak ill of them. And this is the point of this talk where I clarify that these opinions are my own, not those of my employer, from whom I enjoy spending their money. And so these are just my observations being around the Capitol for more than a decade, and before that being a prosecutor. And when I speak ill of them, I'm also going to accept present company because one of the things I loved about Chairman Caligari is that he always filed a bill every session to repeal something that was anachronistic or not used anymore. His staff used to call and say, hey, there's this law that makes it a crime to sell secondhand watches. Does anybody ever get prosecuted for that? And I'd say, knock yourself out, and tilted that windmill. So we appreciated that kind of dedication, and what we really need of is a little more of that from the legislature. But I think earlier Norman mentioned that as a society and politically we are addicted to criminalizing or finding criminal solutions to problems. And if you watch any reality TV, you know that when someone is addicted, you need to have an intervention. And what you do is the first thing is you have to admit that you have a problem. And that's what I want to try to do by starting with quantifying the problem and then showing how we got into this problem and maybe some possible solutions. So we're going to play a little Jeopardy. This is interactive, as I said. I would like for you in the audience to guess how many new crimes created out of whole cloth our Texas legislature has created over the past 6 sessions. And I'm going to give you a little time to think about that. How many new crimes has the Texas legislature created over the past, it's actually 11 years? Okay, everybody got a number in your head? All right, well, I'm not going to quiz you on the number because people lie, as I figured out, unless I make them write it down. But look, in 2001, 1 year alone, the legislature created 34 new crimes. And these are not existing crimes for which the penalties were enhanced. These are new things that they found to make a crime, like shaking your neighbor's pecan tree to get their nuts. That's called pecan thrashing, and it is a crime in Texas. Now, in 2003, we only had 23 new crimes committed. And the person who can answer my question is going to get an autographed copy of this book. Why were there fewer crimes created in 2003? What happened that slowed down legislation? Then? Who said that? Ed, you're right. The House Democrats ran to Ardmore, Oklahoma, so hundreds of bills died. You can collect this after your talk. Because look what happens when they come back and do a full session. Okay, so when you see things like this and you think, oh my gosh, they're not passing laws, this is horrible. Is it? Because pretty soon they get right up to 50 a session. New crimes. And these are 50 on top of 49, on top of 23, on top of 34. Now, we had a little drop in 2009, and whoever can answer this question is going to get a copy of Texas Crimes, which does what Vikrant said was impossible, which is catalogs all the crimes that are not in the penal code. Because it's so hard for lawyers and prosecutors to keep track of this that we had to create a publication that we update every session just to try to keep up with all this stuff. Why was there a decrease in the number of crimes in 2009? Yes, sir? Chubbing of the local and consent calendar. Now, if you are not familiar with the phrase chubbing, do not Google that unless your safe search is on. But what that means is it's a form of filibustering that is employed in the Texas House to drag out the talk on non-controversial bills so that you don't get to other bills that are on the calendar. In this case, the voter ID bill at that time in 2009. And then we went right back up to 53 new crimes last session, plus there were almost 30 new penalty enhancements to add on to that. The grand total is 249 new crimes have been created. So I hope that helps to maybe quantify for you the problem in Texas. And I want to also come back. Notice there's another big gap here after 2003. We're going to circle back to that in a minute. So why should you care? I think Norman covered this a lot. You know, look, just because you don't know it's not a crime doesn't mean you're going to get out of it. So whether you knew it or not, you're going to be on the hook for it if you do the crime. And also I want to use something that Mark talked about that wasn't touched on earlier that is, I think, of particular interest here to TPPF. Look at this last one, okay? Look, when you create more things for the government to do, the government grows. That, I think, is what most people at this orientation think is a bad thing. So my question is, hey, Tea Party, what up? 53 new crimes last session? You want to shrink government? How are you going to drown it in the bathtub if you keep giving it more things to do? So, since this is clearly, overcriminalization should be anathema to folks who are now getting power in our state government, why does it continue to happen? Why do legislators check their principles at the door and pass and vote on bills that grow governments? Well, this is part of the problem. You see, voters love cable TV. They love Nancy Grace. And they watch her show when she talks about all of these horrible crimes that are committed all over the country. Not here, mind you, but in elsewhere that always end up becoming policy drivers here. Let me give you a little example. Now, I'm sure you all know about the Casey Anthony case, whose verdict in her case, her acquittal of murder of her daughter and conviction on lesser crimes occurred after our last legislative session. So the Texas legislature has not had its chance to respond to this. But, if you want to know how hated she is, one blogger said after she was acquitted, forget bin Laden. If the president had assassinated Casey Anthony, his reelection would be guaranteed. Now, of course, a legislature can't do that to her, but they can do what they do best, which is legislate, right? And you see, soon after that, on a website called change.org, a woman named Michelle Dawn Crowder from Durant, Oklahoma, started a petition on change.org, which, if you can look up there, this was taken about 3 weeks after she put it up. 1.2 million Americans signed her petition to create Cayley's Law. And she did it so that no more innocent children will have to go without justice. Who could be against that? And indeed, what Cayley's Law does, or would do, would make it a crime to fail to report a dead child within an hour of discovery and fail to report a missing child within 24 hours of disappearance. And these would be felony offenses, because this would have saved Caylee Anthony, right? She would not have been dead if her mom had to report her within an hour after finding her floating in the pool, as she claims. Now, keep in mind, if you think this is a good idea, that means that you believe Casey Anthony. Anybody in here want to say that she didn't do it? Well, Okay, there, we've got a vote for Cayley's Law. Congratulations. Thank you, Ed. But look, Ms. Crowder, she just felt that something had to be done. That sentence is the cause of more bad legislation than any other sentence in the English language. Just this need that Norman touched on earlier to do something about a problem oftentimes ends up with good intentions but bad results. Now here's the current state of Cayley's Law throughout the country. These red and orange states have passed it, yellow states, bills have been introduced. This was taken in, I think, November. I stole it off the internet. But since then, bills have been passed in Delaware, in Indiana, and in California. And bills have been introduced in Massachusetts, in Michigan, in New York, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, all because of a Florida case. Oh, and Texas. Yes, House Bill 60 has been filed by Representative Guillen, who I've already warned I was going to do this. His staff knows that we've done this because I spent all last summer talking about this because we saw this coming. Look at the filing date, November 12th. That was the first day of bill filing. House Bill 60, nice low bill number. They have been itching for a year and a half to file this, regardless of the current state of the law in Texas, which is that we, assuming she didn't kill her daughter, which I'm sorry, I think a Texas prosecutor gets guilty in that case in front of a Texas jury, but assuming she didn't, we have 7 laws already on the books that would criminalize her version of what happened there. And 2 of them are felonies. A second-degree felony is 20 years in prison, maximum sentence. And yet, we're going to create yet more crimes to address what she did. So, what are the odds that Cayley's Law passes in Texas? There is only one answer. It will pass. Because again, who is going to vote against doing something for the children like this? And the result is we had a penal code that started off in 1993 with about 160 crimes in it. It now has over 225 crimes in the penal code. But that's not where the real problem is. The real problem is why we had to create this book. There are over 1,500 crimes in Texas in other codes. Okay? Look at the occupations code. We have more crimes in the occupations code than we had in our original penal code, with rape, robbery, murder, theft, all that kind of stuff when we started. It has gotten out of hand. Now, why is this? This is something we touched on. And Norman mentioned it also, and other speakers have. When you limit access, when access to civil justice is limited, people still feel aggrieved and still want to find a cure and justice. So what do? Well, when you have tort reform, and that's where I drew that line, that big jump from 23 to 40, what happened in between? We passed HB4, tort reform, okay? We have inadequate number of courts. Travis County just did a study because they think they need some new courts. Based on comparing their population and caseloads from the 1990s to now, we're told they need 5 new criminal district courts just to keep up with the same number of cases per court that they had 20 years ago. Of course, that's never going to happen because it costs money. In addition, you've got mediation and arbitration, which rarely benefits the aggrieved person and drives them to their legislator. The other problem is that it's expensive to sue somebody, but guess where you can find some free lawyers? Yeah, the prosecutors work for everybody, right? And you don't have to pay them. If it's a crime, they've got to take your case or at least review it. So people see this as a free alternative to civil justice. And then the other problem, this is one of my favorite all-time quotes about politics. And if you haven't read The Parliament of Whores, the whores are not the people in Parliament. The whores are us, the people who send them there. And P.J. O'Rourke does a great example. That book is 20 years old, and it's still accurate today. But what he basically pointed out is, look, the more government gets into the free market and determines winners and losers, the more business has to go to the legislature to protect itself and to get a leg up on the competition. So you see people criminalizing things that their competitors would do or things like that. So we should just repeal all these bills, right? Well, Representative Caligari knows that's not easy. And one of the reasons is because you always got to know why a fence was put up before you tear it down. It may not be the reason you think. And then, of course, the other problem is good luck trying to repeal a law passed by a legislator who's still serving in that chamber. Because when he figures it out, he comes on that door and says, what are you trying to do to my bill? So it's very difficult. And the problem is that it's a societal problem. It is. We keep going to crime and criminal penalties as our first solution. And I think it has some roots that are deeper than just general litigiousness as civil society itself starts to fray more and more, and we don't get along with each other like we used to. We want to run to daddy to protect us and solve our problems. We run to the legislature to try to protect us from each other. It used to be that it wasn't against the law to be a son of a bitch. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that that's going to remain true very longer, as long as legislators are reacting to what their voters want. So the solution has to start with them. Thank you for your time, and I think we'll probably have some questions.
Thanks, Shannon. We are running short on time, but I want to be sure we get a few questions in, just in case anybody's got any. So, any questions from the audience?
Hi, so you're saying the penal code rewrite was largely, well, generally, maybe a good thing. The penal code rewrite in the 90s was a good thing. And how can that be done to all these offenses found outside the penal code?
Yeah, if you don't know the history, we created our first model penal code in 1973. Then we rewrote it in 1993, 20 years later. Any of you quick non-lawyers good with math count 20 years past 1993? What year is it? Yeah, we would be rewriting our penal code right now, but nobody seems to have the stomach to do it. What they did, though, is create a committee of all the stakeholders that worked throughout an interim leading up to the 93 session to totally redo it. It was expensive, it was time consuming, but you got bang for your buck because it was at the same time we were changing the offenses that were driving people into prisons, which were woefully overcrowded. So it had some other elements to it. One of the curious things about all those offenses in the Texas crimes is that many of them are never prosecuted. Nobody knows about them, and you almost have to be unlucky to trip up against one and get it filed. So it's from a good government perspective, it's good to get some of those off the books, but when you're looking at the fiscal impact to the state, there's not really that much of a gain because many of these people aren't going to prison. It does, however, help the counties, jail capacity, prosecution costs, indigent defense costs, and things like that. But as we all know, the state is more interested in its own bottom line than the counties, and so the state would have to spend some money to look at this when they're really not going to benefit that much. So someone needs to come up with a better carrot for the state to do that, in my opinion.
Any other questions?
Individual liberty, that's the carrot.
Mark's volunteering to be on the committee.
Shannon, when do you run for office?
The great thing about my job is we don't get involved in politics, so I don't have to endorse or contribute to anyone or get involved in any of that messiness. We just get to call it like we see it. And when you run for office, you don't get to do that anymore.
It would be fair, however, Shannon, to ask, how many of those laws were supported by or endorsed by certain district attorneys so that the state coming to us and saying, we'd like that bill too?
No, that's a great question. The question was take last session, 53 new crimes created. 4 of them originated from prosecutors' offices out of 53 that I know the prosecutor was behind it. And there were probably another half dozen where a legislator fought it for a constituent, then went to his local DA and said, hey, will you support this? And they're like, well, okay, whatever. But these are not being, the things that were generated from prosecutors last session were synthetic marijuana, It's a bit, K2, that was a big problem. Also, a bill to criminalize the use or possession of caltrops, which is a problem in the valley where they throw out, there are these old spikes that were used 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago by the Romans against cavalry. Well, now the drug runners are using it down south to throw out and blow out the tires of the people chasing them. So, that's the kind of example of, a lot of it's by new technology, but almost none of these, and if I am asked, this is why I don't run for office, because when they ask me, I'll say, the legislator or staff asked me, I said, that's a bad idea. We don't need it. Here are the 6 other laws that you need. And then guess what? The bill gets filed, it gets debated, it gets passed. Because there's nobody really to stand up to it.
Is it fair to also say most of those bills, most of those changes, don't go through the committees that have to do with either criminal or correctional things, and don't look at those, but look at occupation codes.
Especially the occupational ones,
Education
right.
codes and those kinds of things, aren't they? I mean, the education code is one of the worst.
And that's why the occupations code has so many crimes in it, because it didn't go through criminal jurisprudence in the House. But when people have talked about that, changing the rules to do it, you have to remember that CrimJur has this, I think, the 2nd highest bill volume already. And so if you send all these other bills from other areas that had any criminal penalty, I mean, I track every bill that creates a new crime every session, and there are hundreds filed, 53 passed, there were like 300 filed last session. If you cram all those through CrimJur, they're not ever going to be able to hear any bills.
Well, that's good.
My suggestion, I'm giving it to the other legislators, so I'll pass it to my Caligari. I think you can do on that would bring some oversight into that.
It's good. I'd like to talk about it.
Norman, you've got a question.
Well, I want to make one observation and ask a question, really. The observation is that we did a report jointly with Heritage on the federal overcriminalization, and one of our recommendations was that there be what we call sequential referral, which is that there shouldn't be any law coming out of Congress that establishes a crime unless it goes through, in the case of Congress, the Judiciary Committee, so that there are people that are looking at things like the intent requirements. The question I have, and I have never been a legislator, I've never worked for a legislator, and I've never been a lobbyist. So my question is, what is wrong with the idea of requiring an impact statement for a new crime? Why isn't that a way to slow down the train?
It is a good idea, and it's one that we're looking at.
Well, and if I may, in Texas, you must have a fiscal impact statement, and you must have we have a thing called a criminal justice impact statement. Did y'all know that? Every bill that would create a new crime or amend an existing crime, LBB has to file a criminal justice impact statement to say what the impact would be on the prison capacity. And it's on the website. If you look, you can click on it. Nobody ever reads them. And
no, that's not quite right.
Well, that's not true. But here's the other thing. They only look, remember, legislators are interested in the next biennium, in that budget. And so if you have a bill that increases a 2nd-degree felony to a 1st-degree felony, 20 years max to life max, well, the impact, LBB is going to say, we can't determine the impact. And if anything, it's going to be more than 5 years out. And that's all their fiscal notes look, is 5 years out. So it's, in theory, it should work. In practice, it doesn't.
Anna.
And Shannon, would you say that this problem of enhancements and creating new laws are both Republican and Democrat? I mean, it's incredibly challenging to get it.
Right, it's a bipartisan problem,
is.
and I'll tell you, I'd say it's a bigger problem with Democrats, who feel the need to protect their flank against claims that they are soft on crime. And so you see a lot of problems with things like prostitution and graffiti and things that, to enhance these penalties, and they're Democrats filing them at the request of their local commissioners or city councils or businesses or things like that. I mean, they have good reasons for filing them, but it is absolutely a bipartisan problem, which means the solution has to be bipartisan as well.
Yeah, I think if you look at occupational, you'll find it's pretty split between the two.
We passed last session a bill that looked at occupation licenses for people who have been in the state jail and prison. And it allowed them, I believe, to be given temporary licenses in some cases. Has that had any effect in anybody's need?
Good
not that I know of. And I'll give a shout out. Harold, here, is this on camera? Harold Dutton has a good bill, I think. I haven't really read it, but it would say people who are on probation and successfully complete it, the fact that they were convicted cannot be considered against them in certain licensing aspects. And for us, that's a collateral issue. Prosecutors, I think, would be fine with that. And it might go a step further, because again, remember, the people who have been locked up are arguably worse than the people who got probation, and so in a way, if you benefit the people who've done time and get out, that's backwards. You ought to be benefiting first the people who are on probation, and I think his bill does that if I'm reading it correctly, but so don't say I'm not bipartisan either.
Any more questions? Well, before we convene for today, I want to say 4 quick things. First of all, thank you to all 3 of our terrific speakers. Secondly, please do not leave today before filling out your evaluation forms. We want to get some feedback from all of you. Thirdly, the next event in this room is going to be the screening of a film called Last Ounce of Courage, and I hope all of you will stay here to watch it. However, if you do not, this is the 4th thing. Go, have a nice dinner, and please be back here by 6:15 on the 6th floor when United States Senator John Cornyn is going to be having a discussion with TPPF. It should be an outstanding event. So thanks for attending our Overcrim panel today, and I'll see all of you soon.
Thanks, Jimmy. Always good.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.